very much indeed, Deborah. Your final quote, I think, is probably a good segue for Dan. It's not only about oil, it's about everything, but it's also not only about economics. Maybe it's about some of the politics too. Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Alison, and to everyone here for attending this morning. Following Deborah is always extremely difficult, and what I'm going to do is offer a few remarks about the context of this debate, and then 4 key themes which I think her book raises. Today's discussion, I think, is indicative of a changing and much changed debate. Until recently, we have had a basic absence of hard information about the actual nature of Chinese engagement in Africa, and this has contributed towards a widespread simplification and exaggeration of stories about China's role in Africa. We've heard many binary formulations about this role, about China's new role in Africa as variously the new colonialist or the new hegemon, and Africa's new position in Chinese foreign policy as the new Sinosphere, or indeed as China's new Wild West. China's motivations, as Deborah has alluded to, have frequently been reduced to monocausal explanations based upon China's resource extraction imperatives, and relations between China and a continent in Africa have tended to be evaluated in zero-sum black and white terms, good, bad, negative, positive, or in terms of threat and opportunity. And I think today's session is to be welcomed as an indication of the maturing nature of the discussion, which I think can advance that productively. I'd also add that the work of Dirk and indeed Adele Harmer here at the ODI have also contributed and will continue to contribute to that. But I recommend Deborah's book in particular as the new key authoritative source on the nature of Chinese aid and how it actually works, as opposed to discourses of rogue donorship or other stories that we hear frequently about. What I think this work brings out particularly strikingly is the need to remember that we are talking about highly differentiated contexts in a vast continent, differentiated actors. Take the Chinese government, for example. Once that's disaggregated, we find a much more complex bureaucratic machinery and relations of cooperation and conflict between different bureaucratic entities in the Chinese government, as well as the various allied private and public sector actors. We also have highly differential impacts, intended and unintended consequences. And if you compare Deborah's earlier work on the history of Chinese aid to Africa with the more recent trends and project that into the future, the questions of project design, of sustainability, I think are particularly pertinent in today's discussion. I think there are 4 points I would isolate as commentary in response to Deborah's presentation. The first is prompted by her remark that China is different, and I think this is fundamentally important. China's development discourse in Africa is based upon a combination of its own distinctiveness and also, I would add, China's common subscription to international standards, including the Millennium Development Goals. But in face of the widespread heat and mystery generated by China's role in Africa, particularly relating to questions of governance, I would argue that the conundrum many Western analysts have faced, and indeed policymakers, in attempting to interpret Chinese strategies of development cooperation in Africa is actually, at a basic level, misplaced. And that what we have been trying to do, in effect, is to force the square pegs of OECD categories into the round holes of China's policies. And instead, I would suggest that China's actions in the sphere of African development might be better understood as a form of developing African development with Chinese characteristics in a manner that folds together classic basic notions of modernization theory with China's mercantilist self-interest, as well as, importantly, aspects of China's concrete, proven development experience at home within an evolving and much changed rhetoric of South-South cooperation. One key difference that Deborah brings out, that China brings to this, is a deep, well-founded suspicion of overarching development blueprints, based in part upon its experience of command-style economics. And it offers instead a very eclectic, bottom-up form of development praxis, whose ultimate measure of success is to be found in outcomes rather than the process itself. In other words, this is a process constructed in line with China's practical experience rather than being grounded in high, often abstract theory. And the practice-based methodology that China advances is mirrored by an outcomes-based approach. Impact is ultimately the only worthwhile focus for assessment, and the standard concerns of process in this are arguably relegated to a secondary status. I have developed this argument in a paper co-authored with Chris Alden. I would be happy to make available, as obviously I'm skipping over a deep and complex subject. The second point that Deborah's latest book raises, and also her last book raises, which was published 12 years ago, is the gap between African expectations and Chinese capacity to deliver on these expectations. We've already heard that the excitement generated by China's development activities in Africa have even been met with notions of a transformative capacity. And I would suggest that the weight of history and some of the current tensions evident in Chinese engagement would, at the very least, make us question this. Beijing faces the challenge of meeting inflated expectations about what it can deliver in development terms across the continent of Africa, and these in part are self-generated by China's own official development rhetoric. This puts Beijing in the position of needing to demonstrate that it is different from other external powers involved in Africa, not just at the level of rhetoric or declared principles, but also in the substantive nature of its development activities in Africa as well. And as such, what I would call delivering difference in substantive terms, in the short term, but also realizing this over the medium to long term, is fundamental for China, but is a challenge that's beset with myriad challenges as a product of its own dynamic, constantly evolving engagement, as well as the contexts in which this is unfolding from the resource-rich economies that China conducts most of its business or investment relations with, to other less, more peripheral African economies as well. And this question of the sustainability of the current energy that we see, I think, is brought out particularly strongly by Deborah's earlier and her latest work. Third, in terms of Deborah's remarks about the changing architecture of development in Africa and the opportunities, the challenges that China represents to this, I would also add that China's current role in Africa is deeply bound up in Africa's wider international relations. I would say that its role can be thought of as taking on the form of encumbered bilateralism. By that I mean China would prefer direct, straight bilateral relations with its African partners, as well as at the pan-continental level. But in reality, Africa's external relations are mediated by thick, important webs of multilateral and other relations, including with established development actors. Given China's significant presence in Africa, and in this light, it's increasingly evident that the traditional donors and aid agencies, amongst others, will have to find ways of cooperating with Beijing. And as such, development cooperation with China geared towards poverty reduction goals in Africa is clearly a key theme in policy discussions today, but it's also a key theme in practical policy initiatives, whether these are the emergent trilateral cooperation efforts between China and, for example, the European Union, or indeed the British government, or indeed the interesting but very putative trilateral cooperation initiatives that we see emerging in the East Asian context, including the China, Japan, South Korean trilateral process, which is at a very infant stage right now. Finally, I think that this book and the subject most fundamentally reminds us of the importance of putting Africa at the heart of any policy engagement or academic discussion. And I think the key challenge is to seize the current moment of optimism about what is widely welcomed as, on balance, a positive-sum engagement in Africa in order to harness genuinely long-lasting sustainable benefits for the continent. And in this regard, whether and in what ways China can enhance Africa's policy space and its potential empowering ability to promote genuine African autonomy in development options that work for Africa remains to be seen, but is worth considering. In conclusion, rather than the dragon's gift, I think Deborah's book brings out more that there are myriad Chinese gifts in Africa, and how these play out and can refract with varying degrees of intended and unintended developmental effectiveness. Despite registering the hopes engendered by China's alternative engagement in Africa, and indeed its domestic development record within China, I think this book also, and quite rightly, recognizes that China's current role is ambivalent, it's highly contingent, and it's ultimately dependent upon how it plays out in Africa. And in this regard, I would conclude by saying how successfully African governments are able to manage China's current engagement in order to convert its inherent potential into a more widely beneficial and sustained development opportunity is perhaps the most fundamental challenge, the nature and impacts of which remain to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.